estimate that a fifth of the 250,000 or so participants in the 1963 March on Washington were white. I was one of them, a San Francisco Bay Area college student who was attending Concordia Senior College in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a liberal arts pre-theological school for students aspiring to be Lutheran ministers. I had spent the summer in a Lutheran World Federation youth exchange in Europe. I returned stateside a few days before the march, spending several days in Brooklyn with relatives who just didn't understand my desire to participate. They thought there was going to be great violence. They were sure that this would be a terrible day, but it turned out to be one of the most peaceful and joyous days in our capital's history. The New York chapter of the Lutheran Human Relations Association had arranged for several busloads of its members to attend the march. I joined them at a church where the Reverend Arthur Simon was pastor. He later created Bread for the World. American Lutherans were not known generally for their passion for civil rights, but a few brave pastors and lay people got together to fight racism in many ways, forming the Lutheran Human Relations Association. For many years, it was based at Valparaiso University in Indiana. As this article will partly illustrate later in my writings, that northern Indiana, well above the Mason-Dixon line, had much ugly racism in its history. It was courageous of VU, then under the leadership of Dr. O.P. Kretzmann, to welcome the organization because the Ku Klux Klan were not strangers in the area. The LHRAA founder and executive director, the Reverend Andrew Schulze, physically frail, was arrested for civil disobedience in the mid-60s in Albany, Georgia, one of the most charged and ugly conflicts of the civil rights era. He was a saintly leader. He embodied Dag Hammarskjöld's insight that in our era, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. He and the associate director and the national youth director of our church body were all part of the march and were influential in there that day. When we arrived, we were delighted by the upbeat excitement of the crowd. We got to hear artists like Mahalia Jackson, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Odetta, the Freedom Singers, Peter, Paul, and Marian Anderson performing. If that wasn't uplifting enough, there were speeches to come which articulated the hopes and yes, the dreams of my generation. Sadly, many unfilled now. The whites that came there were primarily from three sources: progressive unions such as the United Auto Workers, teachers, government workers, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the growing student movement supporting civil rights, and members from the religious community, primarily Christian and Jewish. Although the march is often thought of in terms of Martin Luther King's concluding "I Have a Dream" speech, there were many fine speeches that day. As a young Christian who was trying to apply biblical teachings about justice and respect to the burgeoning racial crisis America was facing, I was especially moved by the address of a Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Eugene Carson Blake, who represented the Commission on Race and Religion of the National Council of Churches. He got right to the point, which still haunts many people of faith combating racism. If all the members of all the ministers in the constituency I represent here today were indeed ready to stand and march with you for jobs and for freedom for the Negro people, together with all the Roman Catholic Church and the synagogues of America, the battle for full civil rights and dignity would already be won. Some 55 years later, those words ring sadly true. Walter Reuther, president of United Auto Workers, also gave a very eloquent speech, while one of the most poignant was by Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who had left Nazi Germany in 1937 after facing much persecution. He said, under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those many tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. 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 Think about it.